Welcome to Groovy and Grails webinar series from JPassion.com. Today's topic is Groovy Closure. Again, I apologize for the problem that we had with the GoToWebinar last Friday. I talked to GoToWebinar folks yesterday, and they said they have a software problem. All right, so let's move forward with Closure. So these are the set of topics that we are going to cover. We will see what closure is and why you want to use a closure. And we'll see the difference between a method and closure. And then we'll see how closure plays the role of as a first-class object. By first-class object, I mean it is an object like a string object and integer object. And we will see how closure parameters are being passed around, and then usage of parentheses. And then we'll see closure scope, and then we'll talk about closure usage areas a bit. So what is and why closure? You can think of a closure, a chunk of code that is enclosed with curly braces. It's a set of statements. Closure is an object, just like a string or integer object is an object instance. So just like a string object or integer object, it can be assigned to a variable. It can be passed around as a parameter or argument of a method, and it can be returned as a return value. And we'll see examples of this in a few minutes. Why you want to use a closure? Closure lets you build very powerful and easier to use function applications. Let you build the powerful applications, and it's a lot easier to use than Java anonymous inner class. Examples of simpler programming models, examples of simpler programming using closure is something like this. If you want to display println hello world, hello world 5 times, then all you say is 5 dot times, and then this is a closure. You pass the closure object as an argument. Or you have an array, and for each item of this array, if you want to print it out, again, you pass this closure as an argument to each method of array class. Here, you are going to call find all, and you're also passing this closure as an object, as a parameter or argument object. And basically what it does is that I want to find all names whose size is less than or equal to 3. So in order to write this code in Java, for example, which doesn't have a closure, you have to use a for loop, which is kind of inconvenient and adds more complexity to it. There are certain things only closure can do it. For example, higher order functions. Higher order functions are functions that take a function as an argument or a return function as a return value. All right, so most of you Java developers are pretty familiar with the concept of methods. So let's see how a closure is different from a method. Let's talk about the similarities and differences. Similarities include both contain chunk of code. It's a chunk of code that can be executed. And the way they get invoked are the same. So if this is the name of the method, you can call my method and you can pass argument. Same thing with a closure. If it's a closure variable, and then you can pass arguments. So the way they get invoked are the same. And they both can receive parameters. So here you can have x dot comma, x comma y, or x comma y, whatever set of parameters can be passed to a method or closure. And the last expression is a return value in both cases. Now, differences. One very important difference between a closure and method is that closure is an object instance, just like a string object or integer object is an object instance, while method is not. And the way they receive parameters are the syntax. They receive parameters are different. So we'll actually see the example code in a few seconds. All right, so let's do our first exercise, exercise 1. So we go to exercise 1 here, and here we are defining, this is a method. Okay, so we define the index method, and inside index method, we have a set of statements. So we have only a single statement, but you can have a multiple statements. So that's a method. And this is the way that you can invoke a method. So that's nothing new. Now, this is the way that you are going to define a closure. So you define a closure here, and then you assign into a variable. So in this case, index variable is closure object. It points to closure object. The way you call closure object is you can call in two different ways. You can use .call method like this, or you can just use name of the closure variable and then the parenthesis. Okay, so as I said before, the way you can call the closure and method are the same. Okay, so let's copy this code and run it in Groovy Closure, the Groovy console. And as you can see, index here is displaying IMO method. Here we are calling a closure and two different forms, and it returns the values. Okay, all right. So key aspect I want you to remember is that closure is an object. That object can be passed around as an argument, or it can be assigned to a variable. So this is a case that we assign into a variable, and once you got the variable that points the closure object, then you can just call the closure like this. Okay, all right. So the example we saw here is that the case that method and closure do not receive arguments or parameters. Now this example, we are receiving the closure and the method receive parameters. So this method receive parameter 1 and parameter 2, and then using string interpolation, we are just displaying that value. Okay, so the way that you are going to call a method is passing the values as parameters. So this is nothing new. Now here, this is the way that you are going to receive parameters in closure. You are going to use this arrow sign. Okay, and then you are going to pass in the same way that you are going to pass arguments to the method. Okay, so let's try to copy this code and run it. And it works as expected. If I just make sure 232, then it's returning 232. Okay, so this is an example where you're passing parameters to a method and closure. All right, so let's move on to the next topic. Closure as a first class object. So the way that closure is defined, so when the closure is defined, it becomes a closure object only when you bind that block of code to a variable or pass as an argument. So you cannot have a closure by itself. You have to assign to a variable or a parameter, and when it gets assigned to a variable or pass as a parameter, at that time closure gets created as an object instance. Okay, so we'll see that in a few minutes. Now we're going to actually take a look at the closure as a first class object. In this case, we are creating closure object and assign to a variable. We already have seen examples here, so it's really nothing new. So we'll see an example again. So here we created a closure object, and when we assign to a variable, at that point the closure object gets created and assigned to a variable, and then you can call it. Okay. This is a case that it's receiving a default parameter. So in Groovy, you can use what is called the it to receive a single parameter. So here we define a closure that contains a single println statement, and then we are going to call it passing a parameter. So again, when there is a single parameter, you can receive it as it. Okay, so when you run this code, it will display hello hello. So let's just run this code. Okay, and as expected, it returns the values. All right, so this shows a closure object is an object instance that can be assigned to a variable, just like a string object can be created and assigned to a variable. Now next, closure can be passed as an argument or parameter, just like a string object can be passed around as an argument or parameter. So in this case, what we have done is we define a target method called the greet with closure, and it's receiving a single argument, closure as parameter. Okay, and once it's received as a closure, then you can call it inside of this method. Okay, now here we are going to pass a closure as an argument. So here we created a closure object, we define a closure object and pass it as an argument. Okay, so this one we are passing this closure object, and this is received as an argument, and then it's invoked. So it's going to display hello. Now, if the closure object is a last parameter or last argument, you don't have to have a parenthesis. So this and this is the same thing. Here, we created a closure object and then assign into a variable, and then you can call that variable. And that is received as a closure object. Again, that closure object is going to be invoked. Okay. Again, you don't have to have a parenthesis. Okay. So I'm going to just go ahead and we'll do the hands-on lab exercises in a few minutes. So this is a case that we are passing closure object as an argument or parameter of a method. All right, the last closure as a first class object example is closure object can be returned as a return value, just like a string object can be returned as a return value. So let's define a method called the A method, and it's receiving a string object as an argument, and then it returns closure object. Okay, so this is the closure, right? And you are returning as a closure object as a return value. Okay, all right. Now you're going to call that method. So a method, you define it, which returns a closure object, and you're going to call that closure object. You're going to call that method, which returns a closure object. So that closure object is the return closure object is assigned to a variable called the a closure, and then you can call that closure. So here you see an example where closure is returned as a return value. Okay, so we have seen closure is an object instance, even though it contains a chunk of code, and it behaves just like a regular object, like a string object and integer object. That's the reason we call a closure as a first class object. Okay. All right, so let's do exercise 2. So the first one is something we have already done it. Here we created a closure object and then assigned into a variable. Okay, so again, the closure object instance gets created only when it's assigned into a variable or passed as an argument, or returned and assigned to a variable as a return value. Okay, so we have already seen this example, so I'm going to move forward. So this is a case that we are passing closure objects as an argument, right? So we have seen exactly the same code in the slide. So I'm going to just copy this code and run it. And it works as expected. Okay. So, if you say hello 2, then it's going to display hello 2, of course. Okay. All right. Okay, the next case is the closure object is returned as return value and then assigned into a variable here, and we call it. Okay, so again, this is the same code we have seen in the slide. So let's just run it. And like this, and Sang Shin. So if you pass different value, of course, it return the different value. Okay. Okay. All right. So let's move forward. Now, I want to actually show you how you can verify, when closure object gets created. Okay. So, for example, in the last example, if you try to, like this, okay, and it will fail, okay, because this object, this is actually gets, there is no, this one does not actually get it's not actually creating an object instance. Okay, so let's actually try with the Groovy shell. So let me just create it. Groovy. By the way, if you actually assign into a variable like this, then it should work. Okay. All right. So let me actually explain what's happening in the Groovy shell. Groovy shell. So here we're going to actually define a name variable. And of course, if you print ln of the name variable, we are going to see the value, but the evaluation of this whole statement, it returns null, so that's the reason you're actually seeing null here. Now, if you try to define just the closure like this, it doesn't create an object instance. Okay, so it fails. Okay, now if you are assigning into a variable, at that point, object instance gets created and then assigned into this x variable, and you can now call x like this. Okay, so this one actually shows you the object instance gets created only when you are assigning a closure object into a variable or passed as an argument. Okay, all right, so that is second topic. Closure parameters and usage of parentheses. So you have seen examples of passing parameters or arguments to a closure. So this is nothing new. As I said before, there is a it keyword which behaves as the first parameter. Okay, so if you define a closure that contains a single statement, okay, that receives the parameter and multiply by it, okay, then you can just call square closure function passing 5 and it return 25. So this is the same thing as this. So in order to pass argument, you can use this notation, as I said before. So this code is the same thing as this. Okay, but if you have a single parameter, then you can just take it as it like this. So this is a bit simpler coding than this. Now, if you have multiple parameters, then you have to use this notation here. So in this case, we have received two parameters, a and b, and the actual function is just add those two values. Okay, so it returns 12. This is another example. Here we are receiving key and value as argument, and here we are just printing that out. Okay, so here we have map that contains two items, and then it calls the each method of the map, and then it's passing a closure object, and so it will return, it will return and it will basically display this key and values. Okay. All right, usage of parameters when calling a closure. Well, this parenthesis rule applies to a method as well. So when you are calling a method or a closure, you don't have to have a parenthesis as we talked about before. So this is the case that we define a method, right? So we define a method that takes the two parameters, and we have seen the example where we have a parenthesis, but you don't have to have a parenthesis, so this one should work. Okay. And this is a closure. So we define a closure that takes the two parameters. And again, when you call this closure, either using that call or just the name of the closure, you don't have to have a parenthesis. Okay, so this example shows that when you call a method or closure, you don't have to have parenthesis. Now, if you do not have arguments or parameters, then you have to have a parenthesis. Okay, so if you don't have any of these arguments, then you cannot just say index. You have to have a parenthesis. All right. Parenthesis, usage of parenthesis when closure is passed as an argument. Okay. Now the rule of this is that if closure is the last parameter or only parameter, then there is no need to enclose the parameters with the parentheses. If closure is not the last parameter, then parameters need to be enclosed with. Okay, so in this case, we define a method, greet with closure, and it's receiving a closure object as a last parameter. And once you receive the closure object, then we are going to just call it with passing today's date as an argument. Okay, so here, And of course, you don't have to have a parenthesis here either, right? Okay. So if the closure, so when you are passing a closure as an argument, if this is the last the argument, then you don't have to have a parenthesis. So this one is the same thing as this. Okay, so this is the second case, is that you don't have a parenthesis around the parameters. And you can also use this notation. So you can have a parenthesis for the first set of arguments, and then you don't have to have a parenthesis of the last closure argument. Okay. All right, so let's do exercise 3. Okay, so we have seen these examples already. So let's run this code. And run it, and as you can see, it's displaying the square values 1, 4, 19, 16. Okay, 9 and 16, and this one returns 12, and this one is basically taking this key value pair, this key value pair, and then just display key, equal, and value. Okay, all right. Okay, so that's an example where you are passing parameters to a closure. Now, parenthesis usage. Okay, so this is the code that we have seen in the example in the slide. Okay, so this is in fact the same code that we have seen in exercise 1, but this time we are not actually using parenthesis. So we have seen examples of this. Okay, but now we are not going to use parenthesis, and it should work in the same way. Okay. 222 and 222. Okay. All right. So now, so as I said before, if there is no parameters, then you have to have a parenthesis. So let's see this example. So in this case, again, this is the same code that we have seen in the first exercise, and we have, this index and like this, and it worked fine, right? This one worked fine. However, if you just remove the parentheses, and if you run it, then you're going to have the missing property exception of this console script. So basically, it doesn't like it. Okay. The reason is because in Groovy, this variable, the Groovy doesn't know whether this is in fact a variable that contains a closure or some other value. Okay, but if it does receive parameters, then it can tell that this must be the method or closure. So that's the reason in this case, if you don't pass anything, then you have to have a parenthesis. All right. Okay, so now this is the case that you are passing closure as an argument. Okay, so we define the method and we are receiving a closure like this. Okay, so let's copy this guy. Right, so again, this is the same code that we have seen. Okay, so when we run this one, and it should work fine. Okay, again, when you call this one, you probably don't have to have a parenthesis like this, and that should work as expected. Okay. Okay, so that is. Oh, okay. Now, this is a case that we are going to pass the closure, not as the last argument, but the first argument. So let's try that. So I'm going to just copy this guy. So, we are receiving closure as a first argument. This one should work, right? Because we have a parenthesis. Okay. So let me just make sure that works. So, if I run this one, so this one works fine. Okay. However, if I try to, let me just do this. Now, if I try to pass the closure without the parenthesis, then it will fail. Okay. Same thing here. The last one is we don't have any parenthesis at all, so this one failed as well. Okay. Okay. Moving forward. Let's talk about the closure scope. Okay, closures can access variables defined in the same scope as the closure itself. So in this case, this closure object gets defined in the same scope as the variable, like name in this case. So inside the closure, you can access this variable. Okay, so in fact, this, mathematical terms, this variable is called the free variable. So when I call my closure, you can see it's displaying a value of name variable. Okay, Sang Shin. And if I change the value of this variable to something else, then my closure should be able to access the current value of the variable. Okay. All right, so let's try a couple of exercises on closure scope. So this is the same exercise, same code that we have seen in the slide. So let me just copy it and run it. Okay, so as you can see, it's just displaying the value that is in name variable. Okay, so again, this closure the scope this closure is defined is the same scope as this name is defined. Okay, so if I run this one, display the right values. Let's take a look at this example. So this one, let me actually explain the code and then we're gonna run it. Okay, so in this case, we are defining a closure here. Okay, so it's an anonymous closure. We are not assigning to any variable here. And we are passing this closure object as an argument to each method of the array class object. So order parts is array object, right? And array class has each method, and each method can take the closure as an argument. Okay, so you can see there is no parenthesis, but you can have a parenthesis if you want to. Okay. And then we have a variable called the full string. Again, this closure, the scope this closure is defined at this point is the same scope that this full string is defined. Okay, so inside this closure, you can access this full string. Okay, the same thing here. We have defined my map, which is a map object, which is defined in the same scope of this closure. Okay, so this is the case that we have a parenthesis. Okay. So inside this closure, it can access any variables defined in the same scope. So it's using my map here. Okay. So if I run this code, and works as expected. Okay. So this is just displaying. It's just adding the values of this map. So if I say 20, then it will increment it by it will actually result 33. All right. Okay, so moving forward, next topic is method closure operator. Now, method of an object can be converted into a closure using method closure operator, which is this ampersand sign. Okay, so let's see examples of calling a closure here. So we define array. And then array has each method, and each method can take a closure as an argument. So we are passing closure object, right? So that's example that we have seen before. Now let's define a method. So we define a method called the print string, which takes the string object as an argument, and it just displaying that passed argument. Okay, so this is a method, right? It's not a closure. Now, if we try to pass this print something as an object instance to each method, it will cause an exception, because each method can take only closure object, not a method. Method is an object, as we talked about. Method is not an object, so you cannot pass it as an argument. So this will have a this will have an exception. Okay. Now, if you want to convert a method into an object, then you can use this method closure operator. Okay, but it has to be an object instance, so you have to actually use this. So this represents an object. So basically by using this notation, what you're saying is that I want to convert this object print something method into a closure object, and then I want to call. Okay, so this one should work. Okay, and of course this one should work here. The last one is without the parentheses. Okay, so let's try this code. So that's exercise 5. So that is this code. Okay, so again, this is a closure object, and that should work fine with each method because closure object can be passed as an argument of this each method. Okay, now here we define a print string method, and let's try this. So what you want to try is, we are going to actually try to print something as an argument to each method. And this will fail because this print something is not an object instance because it's not a closure. Okay, so we have, this exception. Okay, so in order to make that a method of that object into a closure, then you can use this method closure operator. Okay, of this object. Okay, so this one should work fine. Okay, here, and you of course you don't have to have a parenthesis, so we can just omit this parenthesis like this, and then that should work as well. Right? Yeah. So this is another example. So here, we define a method called index1, and we can certainly call a method. Okay. Now, if you try to assign this method into a variable, this will cause a problem because you cannot assign a method into a variable because a method is not an object instance. Okay, so in order to assign to a variable, then you have to convert it into object closure. Okay, so again, you're going to use this notation. Okay, and so let's try that. Okay, so again, it will cause a compile error because we are trying to assign a method into a variable, which is not allowed. Okay, so we got this the exception. So now what we're going to do is we are going to convert it into a closure object using this method closure operator. Okay, and then that should work fine. Okay, all right, so that worked fine. And here we define a closure and we call the closure. And of course, we can assign the closure into a variable because a closure object is, this is a closure object, and that should work fine. Okay, so that's why, we display Yomen here, xxx and 222, and that's what it displayed the second line here. All right. So that's method method closure operator. All right, moving forward. Closure usage areas. So closure is used everywhere. In fact, it really simplifies the programming model. So, we have seen examples of iterators. Instead of using for loop, you're going to actually use the set of collection object, array object, and then you pass the closure, and closure is taking each item of that array and then do something. Callbacks, specialized control structures, high order functions, dynamic method definition, and resource allocation, threads, and continuation. And you're going to see all of this, in the rest of the course, like in Grails. Okay, so closure is being used very extensively. As we have seen before, this is a case that we have a number class. Number class has times method, and the times method can take a closure as an argument. Okay, so again, this is a lot simpler coding than using a for loop to do the same thing. All right, so let's see a few examples. So again, we have seen these examples already. So let's just try to run this one. Okay, so it just display hello world 5 times, and this is an array, and then we are just printing it out. Okay, nothing really fancy. We have seen examples of this already. Now, the next example is, suppose if you want to measure duration of, let's say, some operations. Okay, so what you want to do is that, I want to actually measure the operation of these math functions of power of 2 to 6. Okay, if you want to see how much time it takes to perform this one, what we can do is that we define a closure. So we define that this is a closure. Okay, which takes the message 3 parameters, int count, so here is just kind of the assigned 500 as a default values, and then closure. And then we actually compute the start time, and then we are going to perform number of times specified here 500, and then we are passing that closure as the closure object. Okay, so inside, this is a closure object. Inside, we are calling a closure that is passed. Okay, so basically we are using times method of this count in the number type to call this one 500 times. Okay, and then we actually compute the average value. Okay, all right. So if you run this guy, and number of times, count, and times 6, and average value is this much time. The next example is something more advanced. Here is pretty much the same code. However, here we are trying to run this code with with a multiple number of threads. Okay, so here, so here we receive the closure, and here we are actually creating a new thread. And basically, this closure is actually, as a runnable object. Okay, so the difference between the previous exercise and this one is that we are actually using multiple threads. Okay, so this is another example. And that the result pretty much the same, the result. Okay, so that's pretty much what I have. So let me make sure that recording